Theon Greyjoy stood on the worn stone battlements of Pike, the sea wind whipping his dark hair across his eyes. He squinted westward, gazing toward the open sea, where the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson against darkening waters. The crashing waves below brought the tang of salt to his tongue, reminding him of his heritage, the Iron Islands, his true home, where he belonged. And yet, for 10 years he had lived in the north. He had broken his fast with the Starks, slept under their roof, and learned the ways of Winterfell's courtyards. They had shaped him in ways that were now not so simple to discard. His father, Lord Balon Greyjoy, had scarcely welcomed him when Theon returned to Pike just a fortnight ago. Not that Theon had expected warmth, for a prisoner's child is no true son in his father's eyes. While the Starks had taken him as ward, hostage might be the more accurate term, Theon had grown skilled with the bow, the sword, and the subtle interplay of courtiers. He had watched Ned Stark's measured justice, had felt Lady Catelyn's disapproval like a chill in the air. He had laughed and japed with Robb, supped and sparred with Jon Snow, and teased young Bran with half-truths of the wider world. He had never been entirely one of them, but neither was he purely Ironborn anymore. In many ways, he felt torn between two worlds. Yet Balon had summoned him home at last, in the wake of chaos. King Robert was dead, the realm itself teetered on the brink of war, and every great house turned hungry eyes toward the uncertain future. The uneasy peace that had once forced Theon's presence at Winterfell was unraveling. Lord Balon, proud as ever, had whispered of new Ironborn independence, and had tasked Theon with a peculiar role. Not as reaver or conqueror, that was the old Greyjoy way. Instead, his father demanded Theon serve as envoy, as diplomat to ward off retaliation from the north. It was not a role any Ironborn would embrace easily, and Theon suspected Balon chose him because he alone, of all the Iron Islands, understood the Starks. Rain spattered Theon's shoulders. He pulled his cloak tighter, sighing at his own memories. The battered keep at Pike felt both alien and beloved. Whenever he looked at these halls, he imagined echoes of his childhood. The proud gait of his mother Alanis, who had once held him tight after he scraped his knees on the slick stone steps. She was gone now, vanished into grief and isolation. Could she even look him in the eye anymore, after Theon had spent so long among the Starks? He felt a twinge in his chest, a longing he refused to name. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned to see Yara, his sister, older by a couple of years, approaching in that determined stride she wore like armor. She had changed too since he last saw her, grown taller and leaner, with the confident posture of a captain in her prime. He recalled the pranks she'd played on him, the slyness in her face that always seemed to reveal how many steps ahead she was. She was a true Ironborn, through and through. "You'll catch a chill, brother," Yara said lightly, though her eyes were not unkind. "The wind here is sharper than the breezes in Winterfell, is it not?" Theon forced a chuckle. "I can withstand a bit of sea wind. I may have learned northern ways, but I haven't forgotten how to keep my feet on pike stones." "Good," said Yara, "because father wants you inside. He's gathered his captains, and he wishes to speak of your new post." She leaned against the ramparts, crossing her arms. "It's not the typical task for a Greyjoy, but you've always been something else, haven't you?" He was silent a moment. He gazed at her, trying to decipher if there was mockery in her voice. But Yara's expression was unreadable, as if she were curious what shape this reunion might take. "I am what the Iron Islands made me," Theon said eventually, though even he did not believe it wholeheartedly. "Come, let's go inside and hear what father has planned." They descended from the battlements into the dimly lit corridors that led to the great hall. Theon's boots squelched on wet stone, the salt-laden wind still sighing through the arrow slits. Torches flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. He took a breath before stepping in, steeling himself for the inevitable scrutiny. Lord Balon stood at the head of a rough-hewn table, a map of the north unfurled before him. A handful of captains, iron-limbed men with braided beards and weathered skin, stood around him. Their attention swung toward Theon the moment he and Yara entered. The hush that followed felt palpable. "There you are," Balon said in a voice as cold and stony as the cliffs. He didn't invite Theon closer, nor did he make any gesture of affection. Instead, he placed a hand upon the map, eyes still on his son. "We speak of strategy, but I find it necessary to also speak of caution. Our might is not as great as the armies of the mainland. We must choose our moments." One of the captains, a bearded man with salt caked in his hair, grunted. "You speak as if we should fear the wolves of Winterfell, my lord. We are ironborn, and I say we strike while they're distracted with their southern war." Balon's eyes flicked to him, and a ghost of a frown crossed his face. "Did you forget the lesson of the last rebellion, Harlan? The North is vast, and though the wolves may be scattered, they still have teeth. We can raid, yes, but an all-out assault is not so simple." Then he turned to Theon. "This is why you are here, boy. You know those who once kept you as ward. They have their own troubles. Renly Baratheon declares himself king in the south, and Robb Stark is named king in the north. There are also the Lannisters who hold the Iron Throne. It is chaos. For once, I prefer subtlety to brazen folly." Theon approached the table, ignoring the stares of the gathered men. "You want me to keep the Starks from retaliating if you decide to raid their coasts. Perhaps parley with Robb Stark. Remind him that House Greyjoy still remembers the cost of war, and that it might be better for all of us if we remain neutral." "Neutral?" scoffed another captain. "We are ironborn. We do not play peace with Greenlanders. We take what is ours by might." Balon slammed his fist on the table. "And where did that bring us last time? My eldest son's dead. My seat nearly lost. The boy is my last living son. He's brought up among wolves, so let him speak to them on our behalf. If the North believes we won't move against them, it may stay their hand and allow us to raid more freely in the west." Yara's expression did not waver, but Theon sensed her tension. She had always craved command of her own ship, the respect of the captains. She'd proven herself time and again with successful raids on trading vessels in the Sunset Sea. Now Theon was assigned a diplomatic mission, and he suspected she disapproved. There was no glory to be found in negotiations. She was ironborn in all things. Still, Theon felt the weight of this task. Though his father made it sound small, the risk was tremendous. If he failed to appease Robb Stark, or if the Greyjoys' raids went too far, the North would not hesitate to send armies to the coasts. "I will go," Theon said quietly. "I'll speak with Robb, or whoever leads in Winterfell if Robb is away. I know them, father, but let me warn you that they are not fools. If you plan to use my presence as a shield while you slaughter their fisherfolk, they will not be tricked." Balon's gaze hardened. "Mind your tongue. The old ways are returning. Theon, we are not reavers to kill fisherfolk for sport. We target ships bearing goods, or we seize lightly defended ports if they appear profitable. That is all. Let the boy king of the North keep to his wars in the Riverlands." Theon swallowed. He glanced again at the captains. They looked ill at ease, and he realized that diplomacy was as foreign to them as the idea of bending a knee. But they respected Lord Balon, and if he demanded a more cunning approach, they might follow begrudgingly. "And me?" Theon asked. "I am to ride north and speak with the Starks about peace? Should I promise them anything from you?" "You promise them that the Iron Islands wish only to safeguard our own coasts, and that we have no quarrel with the North, so long as they do not meddle in our waters. Tell them that, for old time's sake." Balon's lips twisted in something like scorn. "But do not pledge our swords to their cause, no matter what. The North is not our ally. Remember that." Theon gave a curt nod, unsettled by the finality in his father's tone. He had grown up with the Starks, but returning to them now was not a reunion of friends. He was a Greyjoy, and the Iron Islands were pushing him into the role of messenger. Yet some part of him was relieved. He was not required to burn or pillage the land that had once sheltered him. Diplomacy was a slippery path, but at least it was not a direct betrayal. That, he assured himself, was better than the alternative. Balon waved a dismissive hand. "Very well. Prepare to depart at dawn. The tide waits for no man. He turned back to his captains. Now, about the matter of Lannisport and the Westerlands, Theon hesitated, realizing he had been dismissed. Yara gave him a sidelong look, then shrugged as if to say, so that's that. Theon followed her from the great hall, his mind already spinning with the difficulties ahead. This was the father he remembered, distant and determined, eyes firmly set on the advantage of House Greyjoy, no matter what compromises or half-promises might be necessary. They emerged into the courtyard, where the wind whistled between the ancient towers. Yara walked a step behind him, and at last she broke the silence. "So, you're off to see the wolves again," she said. "Do you think they'll welcome you as a friend?" Theon exhaled. "Robb Stark might. We were close in our own way, though it's complicated now. He's declared himself king in the north. He'll be guarded, watchful, expecting my father to attempt some treachery. So it falls to you to reassure him we mean no harm, so he'll keep his armies off our shores." Yara smiled thinly. "You were always better at talking than I was." Her words didn't quite feel like a compliment. Theon let it go. "And you? What will you be doing?" Yara's grin broadened. "Father is giving me command of our fastest longship. We'll do some light raiding around the Westerlands, test the Lannisters' mettle, see if they have ships to spare. I imagine in time I'll be going further, maybe even up the neck, if we want to harry the northern coasts. But only if you fail, brother. Only if you fail." He couldn't quite hide his discomfort. Diplomatic success meant saving lives. But if he failed, the Ironborn's black sails would sweep across unsuspecting towns. He knew Yara. She would do her duty. She was not cruel for cruelty's sake, but she was Ironborn to the core and wouldn't hesitate. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're too tense. You'll do fine. Just remember you're not one of them anymore. Don't let your old friendships blind you." Theon forced a wry smile, though the doubt in his mind remained. "I'll keep that in mind." That night, Theon tried to sleep in his old chambers. A small stone room, damp from the ever-present sea air, but rest eluded him. He lay on the straw mattress, listening to the distant roar of the surf. Memories drifted through his mind. The courtyard at Winterfell, the archery butts where he'd boasted of his skill, the Godswood where he sometimes walked alongside the Stark children. It all felt so distant, as though it belonged to a life that was not truly his. In the flicker of the dying candle, he twisted his family's sigil ring around his finger. The kraken of House Greyjoy glinted faintly. For a moment, a strange longing overcame him, for the sense of belonging he'd once had, if only fleetingly, in the north. But that was gone now, replaced by the uncertain path of a diplomatic mission. He was not sure if either side would truly accept him, or if he would be left stranded in the churning waters between the two worlds. Before dawn, he gathered his belongings. A carefully chosen set of sturdy leather for travel, a fine cloak with the Greyjoy kraken embroidered in black thread, his bow, his sword, and a few personal items. He met Yara in the courtyard, and she gave him a quick appraisal, eyes lingering on the sword's hilt. "Take care that you do not return with it in your back," she said, half in jest. He said nothing, only stepped into the swirling wind and made his way down the steep stone steps to the docks. The tide had receded enough to reveal jagged rocks glistening with seaweed. A small ship awaited him, a lean, swift vessel that could sail close to shore. Its captain, a man named Raleigh Pike, gave Theon a curt nod. The crew stared at him with open curiosity. Theon guessed that few of them had known him as a child, and they likely wondered if he carried Greenlander softness beneath his garments. He climbed aboard, trying to exude confidence. A gull screeched overhead as they cast off from Pike's harbor, sails snapping in the wind. Theon stood at the prow for a time, eyes on the horizon, wondering what he would say when he arrived in the north. How would he explain himself? Would Robb even see him or send him packing? Salt spray misted his face, mixing with the morning chill. He reminded himself that the sea was his first love. The roaring waves felt like part of his blood. He was ironborn, no matter what else the years had made him. House Stark might never see him as a true son of the North, but perhaps they would accept him as a go-between, a man they could at least trust not to put a knife in their backs. That was all he needed them to believe for now. They spent nearly a week upon the waters, hugging the coast of the Westerlands to avoid any Lannister patrols. The captain explained they would land in the Neck, then make their way by horse to Winterfell. Theon's father had not wanted him to approach by sea to White Harbor or to Moat Cailin, for that would appear too bold a move. Better to come quietly, as if truly seeking peaceful discourse. And so the days passed in a half-days of brine-scented breezes and occasional glimpses of fisher villages along the coast. One evening, as they drifted near the mouth of the Salt Spear, they were spotted by a few rivermen. Theon urged Rawley Pike not to engage, and the captain reluctantly complied. It was safer to sail on. They did not need to draw attention with needless bloodshed. At last they reached a secluded cove near the upper regions of the Neck, a place of boggy marshes and hidden inlets. Theon disembarked with a single companion, Dirick, a taciturn ironborn man with a broad chest and a watchful gaze. They led a pair of horses along the muddy track that wound northward. The rest of the crew would wait for Theon's return, or so they claimed. Theon had to trust them, though trust was not something the Ironborn excelled in. The Neck was a dreary land of still waters and cypress trees draped in moss. The damp air clung to Theon's skin, reminding him in some ways of the North's crisp chill. But the ground here threatened to swallow unwary travelers. Small insects buzzed around their ears, and more than once Theon's horse shied at something lurking beneath the murky water. As they pushed further north, the land rose, becoming less swampy. They passed a small village where Theon purchased fresh supplies, though he kept his identity quiet. News from the south trickled in. Whispers of battles along the Green Fork, talk of Robb Stark's surprising victories against the Lannisters. Theon listened with keen interest. Robb was forging a reputation as a tactician, a warrior in his father's image. That might bode well or ill for Theon's mission. It was on the 5th day of riding that they reached the borders of the North proper. The towers of Moat Cailin loomed in the distance, half-ruined and yet still imposing. Theon recognized them, remembering the day he had traveled south a decade ago, a child pulled from his homeland. Now, ironically, he came as an Ironborn messenger. He felt a pang in his chest, an unwelcome nostalgia. He told Dirick to remain behind while he approached the fortress with a peace banner, a simple white cloth tied to his spear. The man arched a brow but obeyed. As Theon rode forward, the gates opened, and a handful of Northmen emerged on horseback, their cloaks muddied at the hem. One among them had a badge of House Reed on his jerkin, a small lizard lion. He halted Theon with a raised hand. "State your name and purpose," the man said. His tone was polite, but his gaze was wary. "I am Theon of House Greyjoy," Theon replied, letting the words fall in the hush. He expected a flicker of hostility, but the man only tilted his head. "I was raised by Lord Eddard Stark, and I come to speak with his son, Robb Stark, who is now king in the North." A murmur went through the men. One of them whispered, "The Greyjoy hostage?" Theon had to suppress a flinch at the term. The man with the House Reed badge cleared his throat. "We've heard something of you, Greyjoy. If you truly wish to see King Robb, you'll find him at Winterfell, or possibly with his army in the field. We've had no fresh word of his location in near a fortnight, but he last marched south. What is the nature of your business? To answer plainly might be too dangerous." "I bring words from my father," Theon said carefully. "I do not come to make war, only to parley. Let me pass, and I swear I will cause no trouble in these lands." They conferred among themselves. At last the Reed man nodded. "Very well, pass. But do not stir trouble or we'll have your head. The wolves are restless these days." They parted, allowing Theon to ride through the gate. He felt a small surge of relief. The men recognized his name but had not simply thrown him in irons. That was a sign, at least, that the North might listen before they condemned him. Dirick joined him, and together they made their way northward. The marshes gave way to firmer ground, the chill in the air growing sharper. Eventually, they reached the wide expanse of the King's Road, flanked by tall pines, the branches dusted with early frost. As they traveled, Theon's thoughts drifted again to Robb Stark. Was the boy he knew truly a king now? Did he wear a crown and command lords older than himself? How would he greet the boy who had once been his friend, now a Greyjoy returning with subtle demands for peace? They encountered a small band of soldiers wearing the direwolf sigil near a stream crossing. Their leader, a grizzled man with a thick gray beard, listened to Theon's explanation and then informed him that Robb had gone south to fight, leaving Winterfell in the hands of Maester Luwin and Bran Stark. Hearing Bran's name struck Theon with a jolt of memory, the child he'd teased mercilessly, who had clung to him as a younger brother might. But that had been long ago. Bran was not so young now, though still a boy. Theon wondered if he would even remember their old camaraderie. The soldier directed Theon toward Winterfell, cautioning him that if his business was treachery, he'd regret it. Theon assured him his intentions were honorable. Though he was not certain he believed those words entirely, it was the best he could manage. The gray stones of Winterfell appeared on the horizon after several more days of steady riding. Theon felt his stomach twist at the sight of it. The outer walls, the inner keep, the great towers, he knew them so well. For a moment, he was a boy of 10, returning from a hunt, heart racing with the thrill of chasing rabbits through the fields. But now he was a man grown, with a heavy purpose pressing upon him. It was disorienting, as though time had folded in on itself. They passed through the gates under the watchful eyes of guards wearing Stark livery. Most of them wore frowns, wariness etched in their features. Theon dismounted and spoke to one of the guards, requesting an audience with the Castellan or Maester Luwin. He mentioned his name, Theon Greyjoy, and saw the flicker of recognition, the tension that came with it. But they did not bar him. Instead, a young page escorted him into the courtyard, and Theon let the memories wash over him. He saw the archery butts where he had competed with Robb and Jon. He saw the armory, the stables, the great hall beyond. It all felt smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he had grown. He saw that Winterfell was quieter now that so many of its men had gone south. A hush lay over the yard, broken only by the occasional clang of a smith's hammer or the bark of a dog. He was shown into the great keep, where he waited in a small antechamber with rough-hewn benches. Direk remained close, though silent, and Theon could sense the Ironborn's discomfort in these foreign halls. After a short while, the door opened to reveal Maester Luwin, a slight, gray-haired man in maester's robes, the chain around his neck reflecting the torchlight. Following him was Bran Stark, seated in a wheeled chair pushed by Hodder, the gentle giant who had once carried him about the castle. Theon's heart tightened at the sight of Bran's legs, thin and unmoving beneath a blanket, a reminder of the boy's crippling fall. He had heard of it, but seeing it was different. He forced himself not to stare. Bran's gaze was wide and watchful. He looked older somehow, despite still being a child. The hardships of the last year had etched seriousness onto his features. "Theon," he said, his voice faint, "you came back." Theon bowed his head in respect to both Bran and Maester Luwin. "My lord," he said formally to Bran, "I have returned on business from my father, Lord Balon Greyjoy. I seek to speak with you about matters of diplomacy." He almost stumbled over the word. Bran was not the older brother, not the lord he expected to greet. But with Robb away, perhaps the boy was now the official Stark presence here. Maester Luwin's brow creased in curiosity. Diplomacy? That is not a word often associated with the Iron Islands. Theon managed a grim smile. "Times change, Maester. Wars rage all around us. Lord Balon wishes to remain at peace with the North, if possible." Bran's eyes flickered with a child's honesty. "Father once said your father was proud and stubborn. He rebelled. We lost men back then." He shifted in his chair. "Why should we trust him now?" Theon let out a careful breath. "Your father, Lord Eddard, was an honorable man. He took me as a ward and I lived here for many years. I grew to respect the Starks, and I hope we can find a way to prevent needless bloodshed." It was not a complete lie, for Theon truly wished to avoid a direct conflict if possible. "I bring letters from Lord Balon," proposing that the North might keep its armies to the south, to fight the Lannisters, while the Iron Islands keep to themselves. In return, we ask that the North does not interfere with our own actions along the western coasts. He knew how that might sound. We have no quarrel with the North, and we wish no quarrel with you. He offered the sealed parchment. Maester Luwin took it, breaking the seal with the small knife he kept tucked in his sleeve. He read it quickly, his expression growing more pensive with each line. Bran watched him, then finally looked at Theon again. "It's strange to see you like this, Theon," he said, almost in a whisper. "I remember when you taught me to hold a bow. Is it truly peace your father wants?" Theon's mind flicked back to how he had teased Bran, how he had boasted that he could never outshoot Theon. Strange indeed, how the child remembered even that. "It is what he says he wants, yes," Theon replied carefully. "I also wish to prevent any misunderstandings between our houses." Luwin finished reading the letter. Lord Balon writes that he respects Robb Stark's claim to be king in the North, so long as the North remains out of Ironborn affairs. He suggests a non-aggression pact. Does he not? Luwin shook his head. "It is not for me to say yes or no. This is a matter for the king in the North. But since he is away, we can send a raven to him, informing him of your arrival and of Lord Balon's proposal." Theon nodded. "I expected as much. I only ask that I be allowed to remain here until I receive Robb's response. I have no intention of causing trouble, and perhaps, in the meantime, I can speak with you further on the specifics." Bran looked uncertain, glancing at Maester Luwin. The old maester inclined his head. "Winterfell's hospitality was once yours. Despite the circumstances, I see no reason to deny you guest rights, provided you swear no harm will come to anyone here." Theon placed a hand over his heart. "I swear it." Bran turned his gaze to Theon's companion. "And him. Dirik is my guard, but he follows my orders. He will swear as well if you wish." Bran nodded, his resolve stiffening. "Then let it be so." Shortly after, Maester Luwin penned a raven to Robb Stark's camp somewhere in the Riverlands, detailing Theon's arrival and Balon's proposition. Theon waited, feeling relief swirl with tension. He was under the Stark's roof again, but not as a captive, at least not yet. He was uncertain how Robb would react to his father's terms. The war might change a man, and Theon did not know what kind of king Robb had become. Days passed. In that time, Theon reacquainted himself with Winterfell's corridors. He saw the changes. Many of the able-bodied men had marched south. The great hall that had once rung with feasts and lively banter was now subdued. Bran held court in a small, somber way, hearing the complaints of local folk about wolves attacking sheep or of bandits on the roads. Theon recognized the heartbreak behind it. Bran was a child forced to bear responsibilities far beyond his years. He also encountered Rickon, the youngest Stark boy, who regarded him with wide-eyed suspicion. Rickon had been so little when Theon left, and now the child was half-feral with fear of losing more family members. The direwolf Shaggy Dog prowled near him, baring teeth. Theon kept his distance. At night, Theon sat by the hearth in the great hall, sipping ale in silence. Memories washed over him relentlessly. He recalled sitting in that same hall, listening to Ned Stark's deep voice telling stories of old battles. He remembered how Arya Stark would slip away from the table with eyes rolling, and how Sansa would try to remain poised. He remembered feeling both part of their family and separate from it, like a stray cat that is fed but never truly tamed. Dirik remained stoic, seldom leaving Theon's side. The presence of the Ironborn man served as a reminder of why Theon was truly here. He tried to engage Dirik in conversation, but the man offered little beyond curt replies, as though suspecting anything more might compromise him. In truth, Theon was grateful for the silence. On the 5th day, a raven arrived from Robb. The letter was addressed to Bran and Maester Luwin, but Theon was allowed to read it. Robb's words were terse but polite. He acknowledged Balon's request, stated he was willing to hear Theon out in person, and invited Theon to meet him at his war camp near Riverrun. Robb explained he was not returning to Winterfell anytime soon, as the war demanded his presence in the south. If Theon was sincere, he should come to Robb under a flag of truce. Theon's shoulders eased in relief. Robb was willing to listen, but that meant a long journey south, deeper into the war-torn lands, and with no guarantee that Lannister forces would not intercept him. If he made it, he would stand before a boy who had become a king and try to broker a fragile peace. The notion was daunting, but Theon refused to shrink from it. That evening, he asked Maester Luwin for an audience with Bran. They met in a small solar overlooking the inner yard. Bran sat by the window, the waning light catching the russet tints in his brown hair. He looked so solemn for a boy of his age, and Theon's heart twisted again at the sight. "The raven from Robb," Theon began. "I plan to leave in the morning, heading south to meet him. I will deliver my father's terms directly. But before I go, I wanted to offer something." Bran's eyes narrowed. "Offer what?" "A word of caution. My father is not the easiest man to trust. If he believes he can strike advantage while the North is focused elsewhere, he will do so. But I promise to do all I can to keep him from attacking. I know this must seem laughable, that a son can curb his father's ambition. But I do not want more blood spilled." Bran studied him, as if trying to see into Theon's soul. "I remember you, Theon. You used to talk of the Iron Islands, how different they were. I believed we were your friends." He lowered his gaze. "Then you left and so much changed. I don't know if I can trust you, but I still hope you speak the truth." Theon felt a pang of regret. "I did consider you my friend, Bran." The words rang with quiet sincerity, though they felt heavy on his tongue. "Whatever else happens, know that I never wanted harm to come to House Stark." Bran's mouth trembled slightly, and Maester Luwin placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Theon realized that the child might be thinking of his father's death, of the war that raged, of the uncertain future. He had lost so much already. Theon forced a tight smile. "I'll do my best," he said softly. The next morning, Theon Greyjoy departed Winterfell with Dirick at his side. He left under the watchful eyes of Stark guards, the gates groaning open in the faint sunrise. The road south stretched endlessly ahead of him, and he knew the journey would be fraught with danger. Yet he felt a spark of something, perhaps hope or resolution. If this path let him prevent a war between the Greyjoys and the Starks, maybe he would prove he belonged somewhere after all. If he failed, well, he did not want to dwell on that possibility. As they rode away, the chill wind whipped at Theon's cloak, bearing the faint sense of pine and earth. He wondered if he would ever see Winterfell again, and if he did, what role he would play next time. No matter how far he traveled, it seemed part of him would always remain in those gray halls, just as part of him belonged to the salt-slick stones of Pike. He was a man torn between two worlds, a bridge or a battleground. Only time would tell which it would be. They rode under shifting skies, with clouds that threatened rain but seldom released more than a whisper of drizzle. The days were shorter now, and with each league south they passed clusters of refugees moving north, small folk fleeing the turmoil in the riverlands. Theon offered them little more than a glance, though he felt a pang of guilt. War upended the lives of these common folk, who had no stake in crowns or iron thrones. He noticed how Dirick eyed every traveler with suspicion, one hand never straying far from the hilt of his sword. The tension gnawed at Theon, for he had no wish to kill desperate peasants, nor did he want to be ambushed by brigands. But the roads were increasingly dangerous. More than once, they passed burned-out farmsteads, crows circling overhead. Theon's horse shied at the smell of death. They pressed onward, fueled by a grim sense of purpose. Robb Stark's letter directed Theon to meet him near Riverrun, where the king in the north and the Tully banners flew. There, he had set up his war camp in preparation for further battles against the Lannisters. Yet rumors abounded. Lord Tywin's forces regrouped near Harrenhal, while another Lannister host moved westward. It felt as though the entire realm held its breath, awaiting the next clash of armies. Each night, Theon found himself haunted by memories of Pike and Winterfell. Sleep came fitfully, images colliding in his dreams, salt-crusted rocks and snow-dusted courtyards, the shrill cries of gulls and the howl of dire wolves. He felt torn by divided loyalties, uncertain how this mission would end. He prayed in his own way to the drowned god, though the presence of the old gods still lingered in his mind. If there were higher powers listening, Theon was not sure what he hoped they would decide. On the 12th day since leaving Winterfell, they neared the outskirts of Riverrun. The land grew more fertile, dotted with rolling green hills and croplands, though signs of war still scarred the earth. Broken catapults, blackened fields. As they approached the Tully stronghold, they saw stark banners fluttering alongside the leaping trout of House Tully. Theon breathed a slow sigh. He was close now to the heart of the conflict, to the place where the boy he once knew had become a king in truth. They were stopped by a contingent of Stark outriders before they even saw the gates of Riverrun. The knights, clad in mail and wearing the direwolf sigil, demanded their names and business. Theon answered in the same calm tone he had used at Moat Cailin. He bore a message of peace from Balon Greyjoy, come to treat with King Robb. The outriders exchanged looks, eyebrows raised, but eventually one of them rode off to relay the message to the camp. Theon was commanded to wait. Minutes crawled by. Dirick remained silent, his gaze flicking across the surrounding farmland with the wariness of a cornered animal. At last, another band of riders approached, led by a figure Theon recognized at once. Ser Roderick Castle, Winterfell's master-at-arms, with his signature white whiskers and stern countenance. Theon's pulse quickened in an odd mix of relief and apprehension. If Ser Roderick was here, perhaps Robb truly would grant him an audience. Ser Roderick reined in his horse before Theon and looked at him with a complex expression. "Greyjoy," he said, sounding almost weary. "We heard tales that you returned north, but to see you here, in the midst of war, what do you hope to achieve?" Theon dipped his head respectfully. "Ser Roderick, I come under a flag of truce to speak with Robb, King Robb, about an arrangement that might spare the North from further grief. My father does not want conflict with House Stark, so long as our own interests remain unthreatened." Ser Roderick's eyes flicked to Theon's attire, the subtle Kraken sigil. "War changes men. King Robb is not the boy you knew, but if he has agreed to speak with you, then speak you shall. Yet know this, harm him or any of ours, and you will not leave these lands alive." Dirick bristled, but Theon placed a hand on his arm, stilling him. "We come in peace, Ser Roderick," he said. "Allow me to treat with him, for old time's sake if nothing else." Ser Roderick hesitated, then gestured for them to follow. The riders closed around Theon and Dirick in a loose escort, guiding them along a winding path toward the war camp outside Riverrun. Theon's heart thumped. He recalled sparring lessons under Ser Roderick's watchful eye, how the man had corrected his footwork time and again until Theon gained skill with a blade. Now they were near strangers shaped by separate loyalties. The camp sprawled over the fields, rows of tents forming makeshift avenues. Theon saw men tending fires, repairing weapons, and practicing maneuvers. Stark banners fluttered everywhere, silver direwolves on gray fields. He also noticed the red and blue trout of House Tully, the flayed man of House Bolton, and other northern sigils. It was a patchwork assembly united under the young king. Theon and Dirick dismounted near a large pavilion, where a pair of guards stood watch. Ser Roderick dismounted as well and addressed the guards. "The king awaits inside. Let them pass, but only them. Have a care that they do not bring hidden steel." The guards nodded. They patted Theon and Dirick down for extra blades. Theon surrendered a small dagger without complaint, though Dirick hesitated before unstrapping his own. Inside the pavilion, lamplight glowed against heavy canvas, revealing a table crowded with maps and scrolls. Theon's gaze swept over it quickly, then found the figure standing on the opposite side. Robb Stark was taller than Theon remembered, his auburn hair longer, curling around the collar of his leather jerkin. He wore no crown at the moment, but the mantle of leadership rested heavily on his shoulders. Grey Wind, his direwolf, lay at his feet, rising at Theon's entry with a low, rumbling growl. Theon felt a tingle of unease. Grey Wind was no pup. He had grown into a massive beast, eyes glowing with primal intelligence. Robb's face was grim, but there was a flicker of recognition in his blue eyes. "Theon," he said quietly. "You look well." Theon bowed. "Your Grace." The words felt strange on his tongue. "I bring greetings from Lord Balon Greyjoy, and an offer he hopes might benefit both our houses." Robb gestured for Theon to rise. "My father was never fond of your father's ambitions. How do I know this isn't some ploy? Give me one reason I shouldn't throw you in chains until the war is done." Theon took a measured breath. "Because you remember me, Robb, or King Robb, because we stood side by side once. You knew me well enough to see I'm not a liar or a fool. I do as my father orders, but I also wish to spare the North from a second Greyjoy rebellion." He lifted the parchment he carried. "Here are the formal terms. In short, Lord Balon will pledge not to raid or war upon the North so long as the North does not interfere in Ironborn actions along other coasts. My father suggests that while you fight the Lannisters, we keep the seas clear of any western threat to your domain. You need not fight on two fronts." Robb's brow furrowed. He glanced at Grey Wind, and the wolf's ears flicked. "So your father wants free rein to raid the Westerlands, or anywhere else, without fear of northern reprisal. And in return we get what exactly? A promise that your Ironborn won't invade our shores." Theon's cheeks flushed. Put that way, it sounded paltry. "That, and there's also the possibility of an alliance of sorts. If the Lannisters try to send their navy north, the Iron Fleet could intercept them. My father is cautious, but if your war demands it, the Iron Islands might disrupt Lannister supply lines at sea." Dirick stood stiffly at Theon's side, remaining silent. Theon suspected the conversation was already going less smoothly than he had hoped. Robb tapped a finger on the table, eyes fixed on Theon. "And why should I trust your father to keep his word? He rebelled once before and lost. There's no love lost between Greyjoy and Stark." Theon swallowed. "Because the times have changed, and he'd rather take advantage of the realm's chaos without making enemies of the North. You have my word. Balon Greyjoy knows better than to cross you lightly. He remembers the last time." Robb's gaze softened, just for a moment, as if recalling their boyhood bond. Then his jaw tightened. "I will consider your father's proposal, but there must be guarantees. Hostages, perhaps, or a formal treaty. I won't leave the North vulnerable to raids. If your father wants a pact, let him come himself or send recognized ambassadors, bannermen of Pike, with enough authority that we can hold them accountable if the Ironborn break faith." It stung to realize that Theon himself did not qualify as such a guarantee. "I speak with my father's voice," he said, trying to keep frustration from his tone. Grey Wind let out a soft growl, and Theon's mouth went dry. Robb glanced at the direwolf, then back at Theon. "I know you, Theon, but I don't know your father anymore, nor do I know how far you'll go to fulfill his wishes. I've seen how war changes men. If Balon Greyjoy truly wants peace with the North, he must prove it with more than words. Maybe a marriage alliance, or a vow before witnesses, something that ties his fortunes to ours." Theon nodded slowly. A marriage alliance? He had never considered that, and he was not sure Balon would either. But it might be the price of peace. "I'll carry your words back to my father. May I have your leave to stay here for a short while, to see how the war fares? My father may also want me to gather news of the Lannisters' movements." A flicker of amusement crossed Robb's face. "So you're a spy now, too?" Theon tried to smile but failed. "I'm a diplomat, a messenger. Call it what you will." Robb thought for a moment, then inclined his head. "You may remain, on the condition that you abide by my rules. You do not wander the camp without escort. You do not eavesdrop on war councils. Step out of line, and I'll have you in irons." It was not the warmth of old friends reunited, but it was better than outright rejection. "I accept," Theon said quietly. "Thank you, Your Grace." Robb gave a dismissive nod. "I have little time for reminiscing. I'm at war, Theon, and there's a campaign to plan. I'll draft a response to your father's proposal by tomorrow. Return to your tent. Someone will bring you food." Theon bowed and retreated, Dirick in tow, gray winds gazed burning holes in his back. The meeting left him feeling more unsettled than ever. Robb Stark was no longer the boy with whom he had wrestled in Winterfell's courtyard. He had become a hardened leader, burdened by duty, sharpened by loss. Perhaps Theon could still reach the friend beneath the crown, but for now, the king in the north stood firm between them. He spent the evening in a small tent furnished with the barest of necessities, guarded by 2 men-at-arms. Despite the tension, Theon felt a strange sense of relief. He had delivered his father's message. That was a victory of sorts. Whether or not Balon would accept a marriage alliance or any other binding gesture, Theon could not guess. But at least there was talk of peace, however tenuous. When sleep finally claimed him, Theon dreamed of a storm at sea, lightning flashing over a churning ocean, a massive kraken fighting a direwolf in the depths. He felt the swirl of conflicting loyalties drag him under, salt water filling his lungs. Then he woke in the pale dawn light, heart pounding like a drum. He washed his face, trying to banish the lingering dread, and prepared to face another day of precarious negotiations. Outside, the camp buzzed with activity. Soldiers stoking fires, sharpening steel, feeding horses. Every direction he turned, he caught glimpses of the direwolf sigil, reminding him that he was surrounded by Starks and their loyal bannermen. Yet a faint hope persisted. If the Greyjoys truly kept the North out of their raids, if Balon agreed to some show of fealty or at least respect, there might be no second rebellion. There might be a tenuous peace, and Theon, caught between Kraken and Wolf, might have done something good for once. He straightened his shoulders, stepping into the open air. Dirk hovered nearby, watchful. Whatever came next, Theon knew he must face it head-on. He was done cowering in the shadow of 2 fathers, Ned Stark, who had given him a strange kind of home, and Balon Greyjoy, who demanded loyalty above all else. He was determined to forge a path that might allow both houses, and, by extension, himself, to survive these turbulent times. Only the gods could say whether he would succeed, or if the storm of war would sweep all his efforts to the bottom of the sea. But for now, he would try. He was Theon Greyjoy, diplomat of the Iron Islands, ward of the Starks, and if that made him a man of 2 worlds, so be it. Perhaps it was the only way to hold them both together, if only for a moment. The following morning began with a chill wind blowing through the war camp, rattling the tent ropes and sending the faint smell of damp canvas drifting across the fields. Theon rose from a restless sleep, splashed water on his face from a basin, and tried to still the hammering in his chest. He reminded himself of his purpose, to secure some form of treaty, or at least a truce, between the Iron Islands and the North. That vow weighed on him like a chain around his throat. Yet he had chosen this path, and he meant to see it through. Dirk hovered behind him, already awake, his eyes like flints. His presence both reassured Theon and set him on edge. No doubt the Ironborn Guard was quietly judging every choice Theon made. If Theon overstepped, if he gave away too much in his bid to keep peace, would Dirk carry word back to Lord Balon and twist it? Theon wanted to believe his father's instructions were genuine. Balon had asked for a pact, not war. But trust was a scarce coin in House Greyjoy. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, the sun struggling to pierce the clouds. Theon stepped from his tent, and the damp cold clawed at him. Men in Stark livery moved about, leading horses to water, chewing on hard bread, or stoking the morning fires. A hush blanketed the camp, tinged with that anxious energy which lingered before a battle. Although no fighting loomed that day, the Northmen were at war. Tension lived in their shoulders, in the way they glanced to the southern horizon as if half expecting Lannisters to materialize. No one offered Theon a friendly greeting. Some stared, others walked by without acknowledgement. He was an outsider, an Ironborn in a sea of wolves. That was nothing new. He'd lived as an outsider for most of his life, be it on the Pike or in Winterfell. But the war had sharpened suspicions on both sides. He forced a thin smile when he caught a stable hand gawking at him. The stable hand quickly looked away. They brought Theon to Robb Stark shortly after sunrise, inside a wide pavilion near Riverrun's outer walls. Though the Tully fortress was not under active siege, The fields around it had been transformed into a stronghold of Robb's making. Outside the tent, 2 guards scowled but stood aside, letting Theon pass. Dieric waited with the horses, as Robb had commanded Theon to come alone. Inside, Robb was seated at a rough-hewn table layered with maps and correspondence. A few lords in attendance, Rickard Karstark, the great Jon Umber, and others of note, stood around with grave expressions. Grey Wind lay near Robb's chair, head on his paws, unblinking yellow eyes tracking Theon's every move. The tent smelled of lamp oil, parchment, and the faint metallic tang of old blood. There were no smiles, no easy welcomes. They all regarded Theon as one might regard a caged animal. Theon. Robb spoke his name evenly, setting aside a letter. I have drafted a response to your father's proposal. A silent wave of anticipation moved through the gathered lords. They did not hide their wariness. Rickard Karstark, gray-bearded and solemn from the loss of his sons in this war, kept his gaze fixed on Theon as though suspecting him of treachery. Theon remembered Karstark's brood from Winterfell. Tall, proud men, some of whom had trained with the Stark boys. Most were gone now, casualties of Lannister steel. Theon gave Karstark a nod of respect, but the Lord offered none in return. Robb lifted a piece of parchment bearing his seal. I will be plain. If Balon Greyjoy hopes to avoid conflict with us while he raids elsewhere, he must bind himself to the north in a manner that cannot be undone on a whim. A simple oath means little when we have no hostages or alliances to ensure he holds to his word. I know the Ironborn hold their own laws and old ways, but we cannot simply trust them. Theon said nothing, waiting for the decree he suspected would come. Robb continued, I have included in my letter the suggestion of a formal marriage alliance. I do not specify who must wed whom. That is a matter for your father to decide. But be certain that no agreement will be reached unless House Greyjoy stands to lose something tangible if they betray the North. Marriage is one route. If not, Lord Balon must send a member of his family as a hostage to Winterfell or to this camp. By that, I mean a true hostage, not a puppet. Theon swallowed, knowing well what it meant to be a hostage to ensure good behavior. He had lived that life himself for so many years. And if my father refuses? Robb's mouth tightened. Then we assume the worst. I will deal with any Ironborn raid on the Westerlands or the Riverlands as an act of aggression against the North. We have pledged alliance with House Tully and House Baratheon of the Stormlands, at least with King Renly until we see how that plays out. The lines are shifting by the day. But in simpler terms, if your father chooses to raid, I cannot afford to leave the Iron Islands unchallenged. I'll send my bannermen, and this time, we will crush House Greyjoy. Karstark let out a grim note of approval. Others murmured agreement. Theon's stomach twisted. Robb's threat was not bluster. The North was large, and though it moved slowly, once roused it could be relentless. Meanwhile, the Ironborn could strike fast and fade, but they did not have the numbers for a protracted land war. Balon knew that well, or at least he should. May I see the letter? Theon asked quietly. Robb slid it across the table. Theon scanned the contents, noting the blunt tone. Robb did not mince words. He laid out that the Ironborn could avoid direct conflict by recognizing the North's sovereignty and making a show of good faith. Robb also demanded that the Iron Fleet refrain from attacking any ally of the North, which included the Riverlands, the Vale, and potentially the Stormlands if Renly Baratheon allied with Robb. Theon recognized that each piece of paper in these days carried a potential for large-scale bloodshed or uneasy truce. I understand, Theon said, folding the letter carefully. I will deliver it to my father. Good, Robb replied, leaning back. His eyes flicked to Grey Wind, who rose and paced forward a few steps, sniffing the air around Theon. Theon stood very still. The dire wolf looked ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. But after a tense moment, Grey Wind returned to Robb's side. I trust you understand that my patience is limited. I do, Theon said, forcing himself not to breathe too quickly. Will you require me to leave at once, or may I remain a short while longer? My presence here might allow me to learn any news that could affect my father's decision. A few of the lords bristled, but Robb considered. Stay the day. I want you gone by dawn tomorrow. I'll have an escort ride with you for a stretch, to ensure you don't stray into our war councils or approach Riverrun's walls unannounced. And if the Lannisters intercept me on the road, Theon ventured, I would prefer not to fall into their hands. Then ride carefully, Robb said. They're more likely to prowl the eastern roads, near Harrenhal or the Gold Road. If you keep west, you should manage. Or go by sea, if that's your wish. I came by sea, Theon answered. Landing in the Neck. The rest of my crew should be waiting near the Saltspear's mouth. He thought of the little cove where Raleigh Pike's vessel would be hidden. I will return that way. I'll be out of your camp soon. Robb nodded. Very well. Until then, you are still my guest. Do not abuse that courtesy. He turned his attention back to the maps, and Karstark stepped in to speak of a cavalry maneuver. Theon knew a dismissal when he heard it. He turned on his heel and made for the exit, clinging to the letter that would decide so much. Outside, the air felt sharper. Direk approached with a questioning look, and Theon handed him the folded parchment. Read it if you wish, Theon said, though he doubted Direk could parse every line. The Ironborn seldom valued letters beyond what a captain might keep in a log. Still, Direk opened it and eyed the scrawl with a grim countenance. At length he refolded it. So the wolves demand a hostage or a marriage, he said. That is a bitter cup. Theon shrugged. Father wants to keep the North off our backs. This is the price for it. Are you that hostage, then? Direk asked bluntly. Theon felt a twinge of anger. I've served that role my entire youth. I've no desire to remain a hostage for the rest of my days. Then who? Direk pressed, his tone edged with curiosity. Your sister Yara? Another cousin? Or some lord's son? I don't know, Theon admitted. Father will decide. Or perhaps he'll refuse and we'll be at war. Direk gave a sour grunt. We'll see how this plays out. Let's make ready to leave. The atmosphere here is about as warm as an ice floe. They spent the remainder of the day in uneasy limbo. Theon had no official duties. He kept his head down, occasionally watching the bustle of the camp. He recognized some faces, Great John Umber, with his booming laughter and enormous build, though he did not laugh much now. Roose Bolton was absent, presumably off attending to some matter, and Theon felt just as glad not to meet the man's pale eyes. Word drifted through the ranks that King Renly Baratheon was raising a formidable host in the Reach, with the support of Highgarden. Some speculated that if Robb allied with Renly, the combined armies might crush the Lannisters in one decisive campaign. Others warned that Tywin Lannister was cunning and dangerous. The realm trembled on a knife's edge. At dusk, Ser Rodrik sought Theon out, inviting him to share a meager meal near the cookfires. Theon hesitated, wary of the older man's motives, but accepted. They sat on wooden stools under a canopy. The meal was pottage, thick with barley and carrots, and Theon ate in silence for a time, aware of Roderick's discreet glances. Lord Stark, spoke well of you sometimes, Ser Rodrik said at length, stirring the pottage with his spoon. He believed that raising you among us might temper old hatreds. He hoped you'd learn something of loyalty that might guide you better than your father was guided. Theon swallowed hard. Ned Stark was more father to me than Balon ever was. Rodrik studied him, lines of worry bracketing his mouth. Then prove it. If your father tries to betray the North, stand in his way. It's not so simple, Theon said, though the words sounded hollow. I am still his son. If I defy him openly, I'll lose everything. Or you might save countless lives, Rodrik returned, voice stern, and perhaps save your own soul. They lapsed into silence. Theon did not know how to answer. Even if he did want to stop Balon from launching raids, how could one son stand against a father hardened by pride and grief? Balon Greyjoy was not the sort of man to yield. Theon forced down the rest of the pottage and excused himself. That night he slept poorly again, vexed by swirling thoughts. At dawn he saddled his horse, roused Direk, and prepared to depart. True to Robb's word, a small escort accompanied them out of the war camp, past the watchful lines of tents, and onto the roads heading west. Theon did not linger for any farewells. He wondered if Robb watched him go from some vantage, or if the king in the north was too busy plotting the next battles to spare a thought for the Ironborn envoy. Either way, Theon felt a pang of loss. Once, he and Robb had been brothers of a sort, joking, sparring, dreaming of glory. That bond now lay fractured, overshadowed by duty and war. The escort left them at a fork in the road, returning to Robb's camp. Dirick and Theon pressed onward, skirting farmland battered by the passing armies. The Riverlands had become a battleground for months. Fields that once waved with golden wheat were scorched black. Villages were deserted, their residents fled or taken by force to feed one army or another. Theon tried not to dwell on it. War was ugly, and his entire mission was meant to spare the North from more of it. Still, each burned hut reminded him how easily bloodshed could devour innocent lives. After several days of careful travel, they reached the place where they had hidden the ship. To Theon's relief, Rolly Pike and his crew were still anchored in the secret cove, sails furled, watchers posted on the rocky shore. The moment Theon appeared, the sailors rushed to greet him, eager for news. He recounted what had transpired, though not in full detail. He had learned from Ned Stark that certain truths were best kept close. Dirick offered a few terse additions, praising Theon's skill in navigating the negotiations. The crew listened, chewing over the mention of marriage alliances and possible hostages. "Your father may not like it," one sailor observed. "Balon Greyjoy rarely surrenders any advantage." "We shall see," Theon said. "He wants to avoid a war with the Starks, but I cannot guess how far he'll bend." Rolly Pike grimaced. "Bending is not the Ironborn way. Pray he chooses cunning over pride." They set sail at dawn the next day, cutting across choppy waters that glinted dully beneath gray skies. Theon stood near the prow, scanning the horizon. Gulls swooped overhead, and the tang of salt filled his lungs. Perhaps the sea would calm the inner turmoil. Yet his mind churned with the memory of Robb's stern gaze and the direwolf's growl. He had not lied to Robb. He did want peace between Pike and Winterfell, or at least no open hostilities. But the path to that outcome was fraught with hazards, and each day the realm's storms grew fiercer. The voyage took them along the edges of the Westerlands, carefully avoiding Lannister ships. Balon's orders had been to raid if a prime target appeared, but Theon overruled the notion. They could not risk capturing or destroying a Lannister vessel and leaving evidence of Greyjoy involvement. It would only fuel Robb's fears of bad faith. So they slipped through the waves like ghosts, rarely glimpsed by passing fishermen or merchant cogs. Several days later, the Iron Islands rose from the sea, stark silhouettes against the leaden sky. The rocky crags and dark towers of Pike loomed in Theon's vision, and a strange heaviness filled his chest. He was home, but was it truly home anymore? That same question gnawed at him every time he returned. The crew guided the ship through the treacherous currents, and soon Theon stood on the slick docks, the roar of the surf pounding his ears. A fine mist of seawater clung to everything, making the stone underfoot slippery. Yara was waiting on the quay. She watched the ship dock with an air of mild impatience, arms folded across her chest. Dressed in worn leathers, her hair bound in a short tail, she gave Theon a lopsided smile when he disembarked. "Welcome back," she said. "I half expected you'd be missing a limb, courtesy of the Starks." "Nice to see you too." Theon brushed off the remark, though her flippancy sparked irritation. "I have news for father." "Where is he?" "In his solar, arguing with our uncles and some captains," Yara replied. "He's been restless. Word reached us that King Robb had a victory at Oxcross. The Lions lost a portion of their host. Father's been discussing whether that might give us free rein to harry the Westerlands." Theon bristled. "That is exactly the thing I tried to prevent. If we harry the Westerlands, the North may brand us traitors." "We're iron-born," Yara said, as if that were answer enough. "Come along, then. Let's see how father greets this letter of yours." They ascended the winding steps carved into the stone of Pike's great keep. The walls dripped with salt water, and torchlight flickered across damp surfaces. The wind howled outside, rattling shutters, a constant reminder that the Iron Islands cared little for comfort. Theon steeled himself. They found Balon Greyjoy in a cramped solar overlooking the raging sea. Rain spattered the narrow windows, and brine-soaked air billowed through gaps in the stone. Balon stood at a table with several men Theon recognized. Uncles from lesser branches of the Greyjoy line, along with captains from neighboring isles, Harlan Blacktide, Dennis Tawney, the Stonehouse brothers. All turned as Yara and Theon entered. Balon's eyes narrowed. "So you return. Good. Speak. What say the Starks?" Theon drew out the letter. The men fell silent. He handed it to Balon without preamble. "They are willing to consider a pact, but they demand certain guarantees. Specifically, a marriage or a hostage to bind our fortunes to theirs." A scornful laugh erupted from one of the captains. "A marriage? A hostage? Do the wolves think we're lapdogs?" Balon's face remained stony as he scanned the parchment. Theon noted the slight quiver at the corner of his father's mouth, a telltale sign of anger or grudging consideration. He could never quite tell which. The older man set the letter down slowly, knuckles pressed to the table. "So the wolf pup wants us to bow," Balon said at last, quiet but seething. "He thinks to chain us with a marriage bed or a hostage in his den. They see it as the only way," Theon said, trying for calm, "to ensure we won't break faith and stab them in the back while they fight the Lannisters. The new king in the north is wise not to trust us," Yara commented, leaning on the table. "But what do we gain, truly? We want freedom to raid the coasts without the north interfering. If we tie ourselves to them, will that not hamper us? We might find ourselves required to defend the north if they call on us." Balon's gaze snapped to Yara. "We are ironborn. We do not ride to any wolf's call. Our father's father would spit on such a notion." "If we refuse," Theon cut in, "Robb Stark promises to regard any ironborn raid as an act of war against the north. I have seen his army, father. They are formidable and they have allies. We cannot afford to fight them head-on. We still bear scars from the last rebellion." Murmurs rippled through the solar. Harlan Blacktide scowled. "So we do nothing? We cower behind these rocks while the Greenlanders cut each other's throats? That is no way for Ironborn to live." Balon rapped a hand on the table, silencing them. He turned his eyes to Theon. "Did you see the wolf boys host yourself? How large truly, and how skilled. They've grown since the rebellion you launched years back," Theon said, sensing the danger of giving a wrong answer. "Robb's men are fierce and loyal. He has the Riverlands behind him, and possibly the Stormlands if Renly Baratheon enters the Alliance. If we move against them, we do so at our peril." Balon stared at him as if weighing the truth behind Theon's words. Then he looked back at the letter. "He demands too much. A marriage alliance or a hostage? Have we not already given a hostage for years? My own son." Theon stiffened. "I was that hostage, father, but I was never placed in their dungeons, nor forced to sign a treaty. If you want the North's forbearance now, we must concede something new. That is the reality." Silence stretched taut. Theon could feel the weight of the gathered men's stares, some openly hostile. He was no longer the ironborn youth who had returned to them in triumph. He was the messenger of Stark demands. The air hummed with tension. Then Balon let out a slow breath. "If the wolves want a marriage, perhaps we give them one," he said, though his voice was thick with distaste. "Not my daughter. Yara is meant for the seas, not some Greenlander's bed." His gaze flicked to Yara, who met it with a fearless set of her jaw. "A cousin, perhaps, or some lesser branch we can spare. It would tie us to the Starks, but that does not mean we must rush to their aid whenever they bark." Yara shrugged. "Better that than sending me or Theon. We have use for Theon as well. He knows the Starks intimately," one of the Stonehouse brothers muttered. "We do not have so many family lines that we can toss them around at whim. The Iron Islands have enough lesser cousins," Balon shot back. "And if I must, I can command one of them to the altar. It's a small price if it spares us the need to fight a war on the mainland." Theon's chest loosened slightly. At least Balon was not outright rejecting the notion. A forced marriage alliance was far from ideal, but it might stave off the full wrath of the North. It might even buy them time to seize the opportunities Balon so craved elsewhere. What of the hostage portion? Yara asked pointedly. Balon waved a dismissive hand. If the marriage is sealed, there will be no hostage. The bride or groom can serve as living proof of our good faith. That is hostage enough for them. Let the wolves be satisfied with that. I'll send them a letter stating that we'll consider a betrothal on the condition that we remain free to raid the coastlines of the Westerlands. Only the Westerlands, mind you, or wherever the Lannisters hold sway. If the Starks won't accept, they can prepare for the Iron Fleet. Theon nodded slowly, unsure if Robb would find this acceptable. Robb had demanded no raids on his allies, which included the Riverlands. But the Westerlands were indeed Lannister territory. Perhaps that would be permissible so long as the Tully domain was left unscathed. We will need to be precise, Theon said. Robb insists we do not attack any friend of the North. If he considers the Westerlands an ally of the Crown or not, that might be open to interpretation. The Lannisters hold the Iron Throne, but Robb sees them as enemies. So it's complicated, Yara said wryly. We should specify that we only raid the Lannisters' assets. The North would have little reason to object if the Wolf Boy is truly at war with them. Balon rubbed at his beard, annoyance etched on his features. Write the letter, Theon. You still remember how to shape words in that courtly style, yes? Tell the wolves we'll consider a betrothal. In return, we remain free to pillage any land sworn to the Lannisters. They're the ones wearing the crown in King's Landing, so that means the Westerlands and any loyal ports. We keep well clear of the North, the Riverlands, or any ally they name. If the Starks or Tullys demand we refrain from harassing supply lines to King's Landing, we'll talk about it then. But for now, let them see we're not their enemy. The captains muttered among themselves, some scoffing at having to ask permission to raid. Others saw the cunning in it. Strike only those who are already enemies of the North, thus incurring no wrath from Winterfell. Balon concluded with a final glare at Theon. You'll deliver this message personally, he declared. That will make it clear we're serious. Besides, you seem to have the ear of the Wolf Boy. Theon's stomach twisted. Another journey back across the battered Riverlands. Another anxious meeting with Robb Stark. But he dipped his head. Yes, father. I'll not have you returning empty-handed again, Balon growled. We require a swift answer. If they want to dither for months, we'll sail on our own terms. So it was decided, for the moment. Theon left the Solar with the captains grumbling behind him, a swirl of conflicting emotions boiling in his gut. Yara fell into step beside him. She said nothing until they reached a narrow walkway overlooking the roiling sea. There, she said, resting her arms on the stone parapet. You did what you came to do. It appears father will compromise, though only just enough to keep the Starks from our throats. Are you glad? Theon asked, staring out at the crashing waves. You always wanted the chance to earn glory on the seas. Now you can raid the Lannisters without fear of the North's vengeance. She gave a half-shrug. Glory is not always about mindless raiding, but it's what we know. If father has chosen cunning over open war with the wolves, perhaps fewer Ironborn will die. Her gaze flicked to him. And you, how do you feel, being the one who stands between these two worlds, stitching them together with half-truths and bargains? He sighed, pressing his palms to the cold stone. It's not what I imagined my life would be, but if it keeps blood from staining every shoreline, maybe it's worth it. If Robb and father can remain on separate paths, fine. Let them fight their wars elsewhere. Yara studied him. Just remember, no matter how many years you spent at Winterfell, Balon Greyjoy is still your father. If you dare cross him, you'll not find a safe berth in these isles. You know that, don't you? He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Aye, and if I betray Robb Stark, I'll find no quarter in the North, either. She reached out, gave his shoulder a quick squeeze, then departed, leaving Theon alone with the thunder of the surf below. He closed his eyes, inhaling the brine-laden wind, and wondered if there would ever be a place he truly belonged, free of suspicion and doubt. Probably not. Maybe no one could stand between two feuding realms without losing a piece of themselves. That evening, with a sputtering lantern for light, Theon composed the letter at his writing desk in the gloom of his old chambers. The damp air made the parchment curl at the edges, and the ink threatened to blot if he paused too long. He wrote carefully, in the formal style the Starks had taught him, setting forth Balon Greyjoy's terms. The Iron Islands would accept a single marriage alliance, someone of Greyjoy blood to wed one of Robb's kin or bannermen, forging a bond that prevented either side from turning on the other without heavy cost. In exchange, the Ironborn would refrain from raiding any who did not fly Lannister banners. The letter ended by requesting an immediate response, reminding the Starks that time was pressing, with the war intensifying by the day. He read it over twice, quill tapping his chin, before he scrawled his signature. Theon of House Greyjoy, envoy to Lord Balon. A small, bitter smile touched his lips at the absurdity of that title. But so it stood. He sealed it with the Kraken sigil and prepared for another journey. 3 days later, Theon again set sail with Rolly Pike's crew, heading back to the Neck. The gloom of early autumn settled over the sea, the clouds thick, threatening storms. Time felt like a cycle of repetition. He was shuttling back and forth between Pike and the north, bearing words that might avert or spark bloodshed. He tried to focus on the briny wind in his face, the hiss of waves along the hull, the memory of simpler days shooting arrows in Winterfell's courtyard. Anything to calm his racing mind. The crossing went smoothly at first, but as they neared the Saltspear's mouth, the wind rose sharply, whipping the sea into a seething froth. Rain slashed the deck. Sailors cursed, hauling lines, trimming sails so they would not be battered onto the rocks. Theon stood braced against the mast, his cloak plastered to his back. Lightning forked across the sky, and thunder boomed. A fierce squall hammered the small ship, forcing them to tack out to deeper water lest they be dashed upon hidden reefs. By the time the storm relented, the vessel had drifted far south of the intended landing point. Theon's plan to slip undetected into the Neck now seemed less certain. They made for the coast anyway, eventually finding a narrow inlet that offered some shelter. Another day was lost waiting for calmer seas before they dared to row ashore under cover of darkness. The crew watched from the ship as Theon and Dirick, with a handful of men, took a small boat up the reedy inlet. Everything smelled of mud and decay. The Neck greeted them with its usual suffocating humidity, though a chill had begun to creep into the nights. "We'll meet you at the same place in 10 days, Rolly Pike whispered, as Theon and the rest clambered onto the sodden bank. "Pray you bring an answer from the wolves by then. If not, we'll return to Pike." Theon nodded, feeling that sense of precarious time slip through his fingers. 10 days. He watched as the rowboat pulled away, back toward the open sea. Then he turned to Dirick and the others. "We ride for Moat Cailin at first light." Their progress was slow. The swampy tracks churned under the horses' hooves, and more than once they had to circle wide around deep bogs or suspicious ripples in the water. The bog devils, whoever roamed these parts, seemed to watch them from behind curtains of moss, though none appeared openly. When at last they reached firmer ground, Theon breathed a sigh of relief. At Moat Cailin, the same house Reed men stood guard, though they regarded Theon and his companions with growing suspicion. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," one said. "And with more Ironborn at your back?" "I come bearing a new message for King Robb," Theon explained. "I must travel on to meet him. Last I heard, he was near Riverrun, but the situation may have changed." The guard shrugged. "Much has changed. The king has marched deeper into the Westerlands. Rumor says he struck a blow at Oxcross, then near the crag. We've had no fresh news for weeks. If you seek him, ride south along the King's Road, then turn west. Or see if you can find him at Riverrun. The Tullus might know more." So once again, Theon ventured south, driving deeper into a land scoured by war. More burned farmsteads, more frightened refugees, more rumors swirling of battles lost and won. They skirted wide around any large forces, uncertain if they were Lannister or Stark. Now and then, Theon glimpsed the ruin that warfare brought. A slaughtered caravan by the roadside, corpses picked over by crows. His men eyed the carnage warily, but none spoke. Dirik's face was grim, jaw clenched at the stench of death. It took nearly a fortnight to approach the region around Riverrun again. By then, Theon had begun to fear he would miss Robb entirely. If Robb was pushing west, Theon might be chasing a phantom. Yet luck favored him at the last. Outside Riverrun's walls, they encountered a small party of men wearing the direwolf sigil. Among them was Edmure Tully, freshly returned from some errand to the surrounding lands. He recognized Theon instantly. "Greyjoy," Edmure said, brows nodding. "You dare show your face here again? Has my nephew not given you an answer already?" Theon cleared his throat and tried to sound confident. "We have a counterproposal from Lord Balon. I need to find King Robb as soon as possible." Edmure snorted. "The king is indeed in the Westerlands, harrying the Lannisters, but he's expected to return here soon. He must resupply and plan the next advance. You can wait in Riverrun if you wish, or risk your life trying to find him in the field." Theon glanced to Dirik, who looked ready to protest, but Theon forced a courteous nod. "I'll wait at Riverrun if Lord Edmure allows it." Edmure studied him for a moment. "You bring no more than half a dozen men. Are you certain you won't try something foolish? My men and I have sworn not to raise arms against you unless provoked," Theon said carefully. "We come under a flag of truce. I mean no harm." Edmure's skeptical grunt made it clear how little trust there was. Nonetheless, he led them inside Riverrun's walls, assigning them a small tower room for lodging. Tully guards watched their every movement. Theon found it a strange echo of Winterfell. Once again, he was a ward, this time by necessity rather than law. Riverrun itself was tense. Many had fled here from outlying villages, seeking the castle's protection. The halls bustled with the wounded, the hungry, and the terrified. Edmure Tully tried to manage resources, though the strain showed on his face. When Theon offered to keep out of the way, Edmure was quick to agree. Days crept by, each one thick with apprehension. Theon was forced to pass the time wandering the ramparts, watching the river flow by, or taking meals in silence under the watchful gaze of Tully guards. Dirik grumbled constantly. "We'd be better off riding west to find the king ourselves," he said more than once. "You'd be lost or killed on those roads," Theon replied. "We're safer behind these walls until Robb arrives." The tension broke one evening when horns sounded at the gates. Robb's banner-bearers swept in, proclaiming the king in the north had returned victorious from a skirmish in the crag's vicinity. The courtyard erupted with cheers. Men rushed to greet him. Theon pressed through the throng, glimpsing Robb astride a weary horse. The king was splattered with mud, his hair unkempt, but triumph glowed in his eyes. Gray Wind padded beside him, muzzle stained with the memory of battle. Behind Robb came his bannermen, some wounded, some exultant. Robb saw Theon and stiffened visibly. Theon bowed in greeting, ignoring the swirl of soldiers. At once, Robb signaled a pair of guards to bring Theon to the great hall. He dismounted and stalked inside without waiting, leaving Theon to follow at a brisk pace. Within the great hall, the high windows admitted the last orange glow of sunset. Robb shed his cloak, revealing a leather surcoat battered from the march. Gray Wind settled at his side, panting. A handful of lords trickled in behind them, curious. Theon glimpsed Roose Bolton among them, pale and unreadable. "Well," Robb said, voice echoing off the stone walls. "You appear again, bearing some new edict from Lord Balon?" Theon took a breath, producing the sealed parchment. "He agrees to a marriage alliance, provided certain conditions are met. Primarily, that House Greyjoy remains free to raid any domain loyal to the Lannisters, without fear of reprisal from the north." Robb's brows lifted. "He wants my blessing to continue reaving against the crown's territories? The Lannisters hold the Iron Throne," Theon said. "So yes, They are the crown, and you're at war with them. My father sees no betrayal in attacking your enemies. He only wants assurance you will not consider it an attack on you." A laugh came from the back of the hall, half derisive. Robb's expression hardened. "And if the Lannisters have allies? If the Freys or some other house decides to side with King's Landing, would your father's men descend upon them as well? House Frey has already pledged itself to you," Theon countered, hoping that was still true. "As for others, if they're sworn to the Lannisters, they're fair game by my father's reasoning. But if you, as king in the north, recognize them as neutral or allied to you, then the Iron Fleet will leave them be." Grey Wind let out a low rumble, as though mocking the intricacies of politics. Robb crossed his arms. "Your father wants to pick over the Lannisters' carcass. Does he? When we've bled them enough, he'll swoop in for plunder. Typical Ironborn cunning." Theon fought not to bristle. "If it spares you from a second front, is that so terrible? As you said, your men are fighting a hard war. Let the Ironborn harass the Lannisters by sea. At worst, it might weaken Tywin's resources. At best, it might force them to divert ships. And in return, you get a formal bond. A wedding that ties House Greyjoy to House Stark." Robb's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Bolton, whose face betrayed nothing, then at Edmure Tully, who had entered behind them. Edmure frowned, obviously unsure how to respond. The hall was silent except for the shuffle of boots and the hush of breath. "Very well," Robb said at last. "I'll consider it, but the marriage alliance is not a trifling matter. Who does Balon propose? I have no sisters. My cousins are mostly younger than I'd like to force into such an arrangement, but it may be necessary if we accept. Alternatively, if your father wants a higher match, he might consider one of my bannermen's families. The Great John has daughters, I believe, or Lord Karstark's kin. This must be ironclad, no pun intended." His gaze flicked to Theon, stern. "If the Greyjoys break faith after forging this alliance, I will not rest until Pike is rubble." Theon bowed his head. "I'll relay your words." He suggested a cousin or lesser line, but that can be negotiated. "The important part is that you both gain something. You get the assurance we won't raid your shores, and we get the right to target Lannister lands." A moment's pause. Then Robb nodded. "We'll put it in writing. I want terms spelled out clearly, no ambiguous talk of Lannister allies. If we name a house or a port as off-limits, the Iron Fleet stays away. If they break it, the pact is void." "I understand." Theon offered the letter, which Robb took, scanning the contents by firelight. When Robb set it aside, Theon added, "And about the hostage question. My father believes that a marriage bond obviates the need for a separate hostage. Is that acceptable to you?" Robb's face flickered with doubt. "A married spouse can always be cast aside or worse, if your father decides. It's not the same as, say, Yara living here in Riverrun or Moat Cailin under our watch. But if the terms are strict enough, we might accept. I'll speak with my counsel." His eyes roamed Theon's face, searching for something. Theon wondered if Robb was looking for the old friend he once knew, or if he only saw Balon's envoy. He felt the weight of that scrutiny and forced himself not to squirm. "How long will you remain here this time?" Robb asked, setting the parchment on a table. "Until you decide," Theon said quietly. "Or until I must return with your message. Whichever comes first." Robb studied him a moment longer, then motioned for Edmure. "See him given a room under guard as before. Ensure he has enough provisions. I'll have my scribes draft a reply, and we'll meet again on the morrow." It was a dismissal, polite enough but laced with tension. Theon bowed again, though his heart felt heavier than ever. He withdrew from the great hall, accompanied by a pair of Tully guards. As he climbed the spiral stairs toward the cramped quarters assigned him, he reflected on how quickly his life had become that of a courier between two powers, each suspicious of him, neither fully trusting. The illusions of belonging that once sustained him were dissolving. He was a Greyjoy, but not quite. A Stark friend, but never truly. Dirick and the others waited in the corridor, guarded by Tully men. Their faces were drawn. One of Theon's companions, Meryn Vance, asked in a hushed voice. "How win it?" Theon shook his head. "They're not rejecting us outright, but it's complicated. We wait again, for the king to decide." So they settled in for another vigil. Over the next few days, Theon caught scraps of conversation about the war's progress. Robb's recent victory had scattered some of the Lannister forces in the west, but Tywin Lannister was regrouping. There were murmurs of Stannis Baratheon rallying forces in the southeast, near Storm's End, while Renly still gathered an army from the Reach. Talk of Joffrey's cruelty in King's Landing spread among the small folk who trickled in from the east, and the rumors told of hunger and riots within the capital's walls. The entire realm was unraveling. Robb kept Theon waiting for nearly a week, during which time Theon endured anxious idleness. He walked along the ramparts, gazing at the red fork of the trident below, once or twice exchanging courteous nods with lords who passed by. Few spoke to him. The only conversation of any depth came one late afternoon, when he chanced upon Catelyn Stark herself, returning from a ride outside Riverrun's gate. She dismounted in the courtyard, handing the reins to a stable hand, and noticed Theon standing under the shadow of an archway. She approached with the poise and dignity he remembered so well from Winterfell. Gone was the gentle warmth she might have shown before Ned Stark's death. Her eyes held a new hardness. "Theon Greyjoy," she said with measured coolness, "my husband once believed that you might outgrow your father's legacy and stand with us. I pray you prove worthy of that hope." Theon bowed, not sure what else to do. "My lady, I want to avoid war between our houses, truly." Catelyn's gaze flicked over him. "Then do all in your power to stop your father from any treacheries. My children have lost enough. I won't see more blood spilled to sate Balon Greyjoy's ambition." "There is a chance for alliance," Theon offered. "Robb is considering it." She nodded, but her jaw remained set. "Men speak of alliances easily. I'll believe in it when your father pledges more than words." With that, she turned and left him, the echo of her footsteps lingering in the courtyard. Theon stood there, feeling the sting of her words long after she had gone. Lord Eddard's absence haunted Winterfell, Riverrun, and the entire north. Every letter of Ned's honorable memory made Balon's cunning look that much more suspect. Theon had once admired Ned like a surrogate father, though he seldom admitted it even to himself. In the aftermath of the man's death, Theon found it difficult to reconcile his longing for that sense of family with the ruthless demands of his birthright. Finally, on the 8th day, Robb summoned Theon again to the Great Hall. The king in the north stood with Catelyn by his side, as well as Roose Bolton, the Greatjon, and a few other advisors. The letter Robb had drafted lay on the table. Robb tapped it with a ringed finger as Theon entered. "We have decided to accept the notion of a marriage alliance in lieu of a hostage," Robb said, his tone formal. "We'll allow the Ironborn to raid only Lannister territories. No Tully domains, no Vale shipments, no northern ports, and no interference with our supply lines. If your father breaks that condition, we'll declare the agreement void and brand the Iron Islands as enemies. This letter outlines the details. If your father signs it, we'll arrange the betrothal." Theon nodded, relief warring with caution. "I will deliver it to Lord Balon. Has a bride or groom been identified, or is that to be discussed once we have your acceptance in principle?" Robb's mouth twitched. "We've put forth a suggestion that my cousin, one of Lord Blackwood's daughters, or possibly a young cousin of the Tully line, could be matched with a suitable Greyjoy. We're open to negotiations, but let the Iron Islands know that the match must be of legitimate lines. We won't permit a minor branch scion with no claim or name. If Balon tries to palm us off with a nobody, we'll refuse." "Understood," Theon said, though he inwardly cringed at the notion of haggling over genealogies while war raged. "I'll see this in my father's hands as swiftly as I can." Robb nodded. Catelyn eyed Theon with that same stern gaze, offering neither smile nor frown. Bolton merely inclined his head in his customary silent manner. The Greatjon let out a loud grunt, folding his arms and muttering something about iron-shod devils, but otherwise said nothing. Tension crackled in the hall. "Take it and go, then," Robb said, extending the sealed parchment. If your father is wise, he'll take this path. If not, well..." He let the words trail off. The implied threat was clear. Theon accepted the letter, pressing it to his chest. For a moment, he met Robb's gaze and saw the flicker of memory behind his old friend's eyes. Perhaps both of them recalled younger days when they had joked in Winterfell's courtyard, throwing snowballs or racing horses. But that memory was drowned now by the raw demands of kingship and loyalty. "I hope for peace," Theon said softly, the words resonating in the hush of the hall. Then he bowed and made his exit, followed by Dirk and the other Ironborn, who had been waiting in the corridor. Together, they collected their mounts and departed Riverrun under watchful eyes, heading north and west for the hidden cove once more. The route back took longer than planned. Heavy rains turned roads to sludge, and news of Lannister raids reached them in passing. Theon had to detour around rumored enemy positions. They avoided major thoroughfares, creeping through half-abandoned villages. One night, they sheltered in a tumble-down barn while thunder rattled the rafters. Theon awoke from nightmares of wolves and krakens locked in mortal combat beneath a raging storm. At last, they reached the cove. The ship was there, waiting faithfully. Rolly Pike heaved a sigh of relief at Theon's return. "I thought I might sail without you," he said. "We've no shortage of watchful eyes out here. Lannister patrol ships have been sighted in the distance. They've begun to expand their presence on the western shores." "That might be because of Robb's raids," Theon said wearily. "Or perhaps they suspect Ironborn involvement already. Either way, let's get off this coast as soon as we can." They set sail with the tide, forging north around the coastline. The days at sea blurred together, monotony punctuated by the possibility of encountering enemy vessels. But fortune favored them. They spied only a handful of sails on the horizon, none drawing close enough to challenge. The winter winds began to bite, though it was still autumn by the calendar. Theon felt the chill creeping into his bones, even as he hunched in his cloak near the stern. He tried not to dwell on how many times he had repeated this journey. Pike to Riverrun, Riverrun to Pike, the same questions over and over. Would Balon accept? Would Robb yield? In each direction, he carried precarious hopes or dire threats. It struck him that, in a realm beset by war on all sides, his single mission of preserving peace between the Iron Islands and the North was a precarious miracle. If either side decided the arrangement no longer suited them, the illusions of truce would shatter like glass. By the time they stepped onto Pike's docks again, Theon felt an ache in every muscle, a weariness beyond mere fatigue. He marched up the steep stone steps, letter in hand, determined to see his duty done. Yara greeted him briefly. She seemed perpetually in motion, coordinating raids on Lannister shipping lanes. She asked after Robb Stark's well-being with a mocking glint in her eyes, earning only a curt shake of Theon's head. Balon was not in the Great Hall but in the fortress yard, inspecting a newly arrived group of thralls from the nearby isles. Theon waited until his father finished barking orders at the men. Only then did Balon turn, noticing Theon's presence. His face was set in impatience, though he beckoned Theon closer. "Another missive from the Wolf Boy?" Balon asked, eyeing the parchment. "Speak." Theon summarized Robb's terms, stumbling only a little when he mentioned how the new alliance would require the Ironborn betrothed to hold a legitimate claim. Balon's scowl deepened at that. "The Starks want to dictate who we marry off? They want a proper bond, not a hollow promise," Theon said. "Robb is serious. If we meet these terms, we'll be free to raid Lannister territories and share in spoils. If we violate them, we face his wrath." Balon rubbed his temples. "He's wise for one so young. Or perhaps it's the woman, Catelyn, who has taught him caution. Regardless, we'll give them what they want. I have a distant nephew with a legitimate claim. Theon Greyjoy. His father was my brother's second son. He's not entirely worthless, but he's far enough removed from the main line that if something goes amiss, we won't weep too hard." Theon swallowed. "We must ensure Robb does not see it as an insult. Theon must have at least a faint respectability." Balon's lip curled. "We'll dress him up, make him passable as a suitor. Let the wolves be satisfied." For now, that is enough. Write a letter confirming we agree to the betrothal. We'll have Heron sail to meet them if they want to finalize matters. Then we begin our raids upon Lannister waters." He turned away, already barking new orders to Yara and the captains. They discussed which ports were ripe for attack, the best routes to avoid tangling with Lannister war galleys. Theon stood off to the side, letter still in hand, a knot of tension gathering behind his eyes. It seemed that, with every step forward, the path grew more tangled. So long as the Ironborn restricted themselves to harassing the Westerlands, Robb Stark might hold to the truce. But one misstep could turn everything to ruin. He composed Balon's acceptance in an austere, formal tone, stressing that House Greyjoy agreed to a legitimate betrothal, Heron Greyjoy to whichever noble lady House Stark deemed suitable. In return, House Stark acknowledged the Ironborn's right to wage war on Lannister lands without labeling it aggression against the North. The letter concluded with a vow that Pike would not encroach on any neutral or northern territory. After writing, Theon sealed it and presented it to Balon for his mark. Balon added a few curt lines in his own rough hand, as if unwilling to let Theon's words stand unaltered. Thus began a fresh wave of uncertainties. Over the coming weeks, Theon watched as raiding ships left Pike's Harbor under Yara's command, heading south to strike Lannister supply routes near Case, near Fair Isle, wherever a vulnerable port or merchant line might be found. Reports came back of successful raids, gold, grain, and sometimes captives. Theon's gut churned at hearing of captives taken, but he knew that was the Ironborn way. Balon was careful, though. Any port rumored to have ties to the Tullus or the North was left unmolested. Robb's Raven arrived in due course, bearing a short reply. The king in the North agreed in principle, and a meeting would be arranged at Seaguard or Saltcliffe for Heron Greyjoy to meet the prospective bride. All must be witnessed by neutral parties to ensure good faith. The date was not yet set, but it would be soon. Theon found himself in a strange lull. He had played his part, forging the initial contact. Now others took up the details. Heron Greyjoy was summoned from Harlaw, a young man of 20, stoutly built, with an anxious cast to his eyes. He had never expected such a role and seemed ill at ease with the talk of forging a wedding pact with a mainlander. Still, he bowed to Balon's wishes. Meanwhile, Yara's raids continued, and Theon braced himself for the inevitable question. How long before one of these raids inadvertently hit a Tully or northern ship, or caused some alliance to shift? War was fluid, allies changed by the day. All it would take was one slip of the Iron Fleet's axes to burn a vessel that belonged to a family loyal to the North. Then everything Theon had worked for would crumble. It was in the midst of this uneasy waiting that a raven arrived from Riverrun bearing dire news. The letter, addressed to Balon Greyjoy, contained a terse message. King Renly Baratheon was dead, slain in mysterious circumstances at his camp near Storm's End. With Renly gone, much of his army was in disarray. Some of the Reach Lords shifted allegiance to King Joffrey or to Stannis Baratheon. The realm's alliances were in flux. Robb Stark's letter warned that if the Ironborn mistakenly attacked any vessel from the Reach that might soon align with the North, the pact would be undone. He urged caution, naming specific banners that might come over to their cause. Balon read the letter with a snort. The wolves want us to do their guesswork. Enough. We'll raid where we like. If the Reach declares for the Lannisters, we strike them as well. Theon stepped forward, heart pounding. Father, that's not wise. Robb specifically warns that some of the Reach Lords may join him. If we attack them prematurely, it's as if we're attacking the North. Balon's eyes blazed. So the young wolf would have us muzzle ourselves until he clarifies who belongs to whom? By the time that's settled, we might have lost valuable spoils. I will not wait, Theon. Anger flared in Theon's chest. If you break the pact, do not expect Robb to stand idle. He has beaten the Lannisters in the field more than once. If he turns his full attention on us, let him try, Balon snarled. We hold the seas, and the North cannot march across water. I survived one rebellion. I'll not cower in fear of another. Before Theon could protest further, Balon stomped away, summoning Yara. The captains followed, a swirl of hard faces and eager talk of fresh conquests. Theon stood there, chest tight, realizing all too well that the fragile arrangement he'd labored to create might be undone by his father's lust for plunder. Ned Stark's words echoed in his memory. War is easier than peace, because men are greedy, men are proud. Theon felt the cold press of that truth on his soul. Desperate, he turned to Harren, who lingered uncertainly at the edge of the yard. "Harren," Theon said, "you must talk to my father. Make him see reason. If you are to marry a northern bride, the last thing we need is open conflict. Or do you want to wed into a family that will despise you on sight, because your kin burned their lands?" Harren looked pained. "I'm just a cousin, Theon. Lord Balon barely listens to me, but I don't want to marry into a war that dooms us all. I'll try to speak up, though I doubt he'll heed me." Theon gave a curt nod, feeling a deep sense of futility. Theon Greyjoy was not a man to be swayed by half measures. He would chase the lure of spoils unless a greater fear or threat loomed. And if Robb Stark got wind of any aggression that touched the North or its allies, the entire bargain would lie in ruins. In the days that followed, Theon wrestled with what to do. He took to pacing the damp corridors of Pike, mind-churning. Each time a new band of raiders returned, he sought to learn if they had indeed targeted only Lannister banners. So far, that seemed the case. But the lines were blurring, the chaos of Renly's death and the fracturing of the Baratheon cause complicating everything. One evening, he confronted Yara in a corridor lit by a single torch. "You must stop father from overreaching," he pleaded. "The North will have its eyes on every move we make now. If one of your ships raids a fleet that's sworn to a new alliance with Robb, there will be no going back." Yara shook her head, exasperated. "I do what our father commands. If I start picking and choosing based on which Greenlanders might maybe join the Wolf Boys' cause, I'll never hoist anchor. We're raiders, Theon, not maesters with ravens who track every shifting banner. The sea is ours to roam, and we take what we can. That's how it's always been." He ran a hand through his hair, despair edging his voice. "It won't always be that way if the North invades. They could blockade us, starve us out, eventually. The North is huge." She silenced him with a glare. "So you'd have us become meek, waiting for scraps from the Stark table? We are Ironborn. If Balon's plan fails, then we die with our axes in hand, as the drowned god intended." Fury and hopelessness warred within Theon. He wanted to shout that it didn't have to be that way, that he had glimpsed a different path in Winterfell. But Yara's expression made it clear that argument would fall on deaf ears. She gave him a dismissive snort and stalked away. A knot of anxiety coiled in Theon's gut, as though the swirling sea had taken residence inside him. Each day that passed, he felt closer to the brink of a decision that would change the fate of two houses, and possibly the entire war. If Balon continued to push his luck, Theon could see no outcome but bloodshed. And if that happened, would Theon stand with his father or with the family who had once sheltered him? The question tormented him whenever he closed his eyes. Ravens flew between Pike and Riverrun at intervals, hashing out details of the upcoming wedding. Harren Greyjoy was to be betrothed to a cousin of House Tully, a distant niece of Edmure's, though the final match had not been announced. Plans for the ceremony included a neutral site, possibly Seaguard, where Tully and Greyjoy lords could gather under the auspices of the Seven or the Drowned God, whichever they preferred. The official purpose was to bind the two houses with solemn vows. All of it might come to naught if the Ironborn unwittingly attacked a future ally. But for now, the letters from Robb remained businesslike, lacking condemnation. Theon could only pray Balon's reavers had not yet touched a ship that would unravel the peace. So the uncertain dance continued. Some days brought fresh rumors. Stannis Baratheon marched on King's Landing, or Lannister armies had sacked a loyal Tully outpost. The realm was on fire, yet the Iron Islands seemed strangely safe, the waves forming a natural moat around their ambitions. Theon felt that isolation as both a blessing and a curse. The Ironborn had the freedom to strike by sea, but if they sowed chaos in the wrong place, their foes would come for them in force. One storm-lashed evening, Theon stood alone on the ramparts, gazing at the Black Sea. His cloak flapped around him, and the wind tasted of salt and fear. He recalled how Ned Stark had once explained that loyalty was tested by adversity, not convenience. If that was so, Theon's loyalty to either side was being dragged across hot coals daily. He pictured Robb Stark, the boy turned king. Did Robb ever think of him now, in quiet moments, remembering the times they'd laughed over shared jests? Or had Theon become just another potential threat, a piece in the chessboard of war? He wondered if Robb believed, deep down, that Theon still harbored some shred of real friendship. The memory of Robb's face, cold, yet not without a flicker of warmth, gnawed at Theon's soul. When the wind grew too fierce, he retreated to his chamber. Sleep eluded him, the question that churned in his mind. Could he, Theon Greyjoy, forcibly stop his father if Balon decided to betray the pact? The notion was almost unthinkable. Balon was the head of their house, the lord of the Iron Islands. He commanded the loyalty of captains who would kill any man that raised a hand against him. Yet Theon could not shake the dread that soon a moment would come when he had to choose which father's legacy truly guided him: Ned Stark's sense of honor or Balon Greyjoy's iron rule. And so, day by day, the tenuous peace held by the slimmest of threads. A half-dozen more raids struck Lannister interests on the sea, gleaning gold, weapons, and supplies. No word came of any accidental assault on Tully or Northmen. Balon grew more confident, or perhaps more smug. Yara boasted of her conquests, though she did so with the wry edge of one who dared the fates. Then, at last, a raven arrived bearing the long-anticipated summons. The wedding between Theon Greyjoy and the Tully cousin was set for 2 moons hence at Seaguard. A neutral coterie of lords would attend, some from the north, some from the Riverlands, some from the Iron Islands. Even a few from the Vale might come as witnesses, should they choose. The letter, marked by Edmure Tully's hand, confirmed that Robb Stark would be present, to bless the union on behalf of the North. Balon read the note in Theon's presence, scowling at the formal language. Then he tossed it on the table. So the time comes. The wolves truly mean to tie themselves to our line. We'll sail for Seaguard in a month, give or take. Let them keep their eyes peeled for any duplicity. We have none planned. Or do we, Theon? Not that I know of, Theon said warily, though you rarely share all your intentions. Balon snorted. You suspect me of setting a trap? If I wanted the wolves gutted, I'd do it in their own den. But no, this suits my aims for now. Let us gather. We'll give them a show of good faith. Harren can do his duty, and we keep raiding the Lannisters. His tone turned sardonic. And if the day ever comes that the North crosses us, we'll let them remember that we're not so easily tamed. Theon felt a sliver of relief. At least Balon was not openly plotting to sabotage the wedding. If it went smoothly, the pact would be sealed in front of half the realm. That might grant it more resilience than all the letters in the world. He only prayed that the Ironborn swords didn't slip and strike an unapproved target before that day came. In the weeks leading up to the departure, Theon Greyjoy was outfitted with armor and finery befitting his status. Theon, ironically, found himself giving Harren pointers on courtly manners. He recalled bits of the lessons from Winterfell: how to bow properly, how to speak with a certain courtesy, how to avoid the worst social pitfalls. Harren struggled, tripping over phrases of polite address. Still, he tried. Theon guessed that Harren, for all his Ironborn heritage, wanted to appear worthy to his new bride. Or maybe he simply feared the scorn of these mainland lords. Yara, meanwhile, gathered the strongest of the Iron Fleet to escort the wedding party, a show of force to prove that the Iron Islands were not beggars. Balon intended to lead the expedition himself, though Theon suspected it was partly to ensure his own presence intimidated potential treachery. The idea of crossing open seas with so many warships, only to negotiate a wedding, felt surreal to Theon. But so was everything in these times. The night before they were set to embark, Theon walked the docks alone, lamp in hand. The tide lapped against the pylons, sending briny gusts across his face. He gazed at the assembled longships, their prows carved with kraken designs. Lanterns bobbed on a few decks, revealing shadows of men checking rigging. Overhead, the sky was moonless, stars muffled by thick clouds. He thought of the day he was taken from Pike to Winterfell so many years ago, a child who barely understood the meaning of hostage. Now he returned as a grown man, bridging a precarious alliance. Ned Stark was gone. Balon was older, hardened by grief, but no less proud. Theon himself felt like a traveler with no anchor, pulled in two directions. The sense of not truly belonging anywhere gnawed at him, as did a faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the wedding would prevent a war that would otherwise claim thousands of lives. In the morning, the fleet set sail. The ships rode out of the harbor, sails snapping in a stiff wind. Balon stood at the prow of the largest vessel, the Iron Victory, his eyes scanning the horizon as if daring any foe to stand in his way. Yara captained another, armed to the teeth. Harren paced nervously on deck, dressed in a fine cloak lined with fur, as if uncertain how a wedding might be more frightening than battle. Theon stood near Harren, offering quiet reassurances. Seagard is a strong fortress, but do not let that intimidate you. The Tully cousin you'll wed, her name is Celia or Serral. I'm not certain. She'll be as nervous as you. You need only show courtesy and confidence. Robb Stark will be there, but he's not your enemy if you keep your word. Harren nodded, though the tension in his jaw remained. If we secure this marriage, do you think the North will truly accept us? Theon let out a breath. They'll never love us, not truly, but they might tolerate us, and that is better than war. Harren swallowed. Good. I'd rather not see blood spilled at my wedding. The crossing took days of steady sailing. They skirted the edges of the Westerlands, mindful of Lannister patrols, but saw none. The wind was cold, the sky overcast. Rain pelted the decks more than once, forcing them to bail water. Balon kept them moving relentlessly forward, pushing for Seagard with single-minded purpose. Theon found it both exhilarating and nerve-wracking, as if the gods themselves tested their resolve. When at last they approached the coastline near Seagard, a watchtower signaled their arrival. Northern and Riverland's banners were visible on the ramparts. Several ships flying the sigil of House Mallister patrolled near the harbor, normally no friend to the Ironborn. The tension grew thick as the Iron Fleet rode in. Balon's lips curled at sight of Mallister ships, but he allowed no aggression. The terms of safe passage had been arranged in advance. The ships parted to let the Ironborn approach the docks. A delegation waited on the quay. Lord Jason Mallister himself, Edmure Tully, several bannermen, and a small retinue of guards. Theon scanned the crowd, heart pounding, until he spotted Robb Stark standing slightly behind them, wearing a mantle of gray fur. Gray wind paced at Robb's heels, huge head held high. The presence of the direwolf sent a ripple of apprehension through the Ironborn ranks. Theon Greyjoy disembarked first, stepping onto Seagard's docks with a regal bearing, Yara at his side, Theon and Harren behind them. The rest of the Ironborn captains fanned out, their hands kept clear of weapons, though tension radiated from them. A hush spread over the gathered watchers, as though no one dared breathe too deeply. Mallister greeted them, voice clipped but polite. Lord Balon Greyjoy, on behalf of House Mallister and House Tully, welcome to Seagard. We trust you've come for peace and the wedding that seals it. Balon inclined his head the barest fraction. Aye, we come to uphold our word. Robb stepped forward. Robb the king in the north, face set in an inscrutable mask. Lord Balon, he said, I hope the seas treated you kindly. My lords and I are ready to finalize this alliance, provided you have kept to the letter of our agreements. Balon's eyes narrowed slightly, but he met Robb's gaze. We've raided only Lannister-held coasts and shipping. None who bear your banner have been touched, as promised. Ask around if you doubt me. Theon exhaled slowly, relief flickering. So far, so good. Edmure nodded, exchanging a glance with Mallister. Let us move inside, Edmure said. We've prepared quarters for you. Tomorrow, the ceremony will take place in the Sept, to be witnessed by all. Balon's mouth tightened at the mention of a sept, but he gave a curt nod. Very well. They climbed the stone steps leading into Seaguard's courtyard. Rain pattered on the cobblestones, the sky a dull silver. Guards lined the walls, watchful. Theon felt as if he walked a tightrope. One false step, one insult, and swords might be drawn. As they entered the keep, Theon caught Robb's eye for a moment. Robb gave him a slight nod of acknowledgement, neither warm nor cold, and then turned to speak quietly with Edmure. Theon followed in Balon's wake, Harren close by, the entire retinue moving as a brittle, uneasy procession. Inside, the corridors were lit by torches. Servants hurried to show the Ironborn their chambers. Balon had a set of rooms near the main hall, while Theon found himself assigned a smaller chamber with a single window overlooking the courtyard. He set down his travel bag, trying to calm the royal in his chest. Tomorrow would see the official betrothal or wedding. He wasn't certain if they meant to hold it all at once, and if it went well, the two houses would be bound in the eyes of the realm. Could something this momentous truly hold? Evening brought a small feast, though tension hung over the tables like a shroud. Theon sat with Yara, Harren, and a few Ironborn captains off to one side, while Robb, Edmure, and the Malisters occupied the dais. Balon was seated near Robb, a forced courtesy. Conversation was minimal. Theon ate roasted fish and stale bread, washing it down with watered wine. He tried to keep an eye on Harren, who was introduced briefly to Lady Celia Tully, a slim girl of 17 with auburn hair. She looked nervous but determined, offering a polite curtsy that Harren returned, somewhat awkwardly. The first encounter seemed free of disaster, which Theon counted as a small victory. At one point, Robb rose to address the hall. Tomorrow, we bear witness to the union of House Tully and House Greyjoy, forging a bond that we pray will spare our lands further bloodshed. Let any who would disrupt this vow think twice, for there will be no leniency if this trust is broken. His words carried an undercurrent of warning, eyes sweeping across the Ironborn present. Then he lifted his cup. To peace, however fragile, in these troubled times. A few voices echoed, "To peace." Theon joined in, though a chill passed over him. Balon drank mechanically, face set like stone. Yara smirked faintly. Harren darted a glance at Lady Celia, who lowered her gaze, cheeks coloring. The tension in the air was palpable, but no one dared challenge the king's toast. When the feast ended, Theon slipped away, ducking out before Balon could rope him into any conversation. He wandered the corridors, lost in thought, until a voice stopped him from behind. Turning, he found Robb standing there, alone, gray wind at his side. The direwolf's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. "Theon," Robb said quietly, "walk with me a moment?" Theon swallowed. "Of course." They strode side by side down the corridor, guards posted at intervals. Robb led him out into a small courtyard where the night air was damp and cold. Torchlight flickered off wet stones. Gray wind patted ahead, sniffing the ground. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Robb exhaled. "So this is it," the king in the north murmured. "The day we attempt to tie our houses together and hope your father stays his hand. Are you certain he will?" Theon hesitated. "Certain? No. But he's agreed, and he's not one to waste time sailing to a wedding he plans to sabotage. If he truly meant to betray you, he wouldn't do it in front of half the North's lords." Robb nodded, though uncertainty glimmered in his eyes. "Let's hope so. I keep remembering how your father once rose in rebellion. My father, Ned, put it down. I wonder if that memory still sours his soul." "It does," Theon admitted softly. "He lost 2 sons in that war. He's not the same man. He won't bend easily. But I think he's clever enough to see that fighting the North now would be a fool's errand." Robb studied Theon's face by the wavering light. "I once called you brother, Theon. I hope that part of you remains. I hope, if this pact ever wavers, you'll do what's right for the people of the North, not just House Greyjoy." Theon's throat felt tight. "I don't want innocents to die, Robb. If I can prevent that, I will." Grey Wind paused, glancing up at Theon with unreadable eyes. Robb placed a hand on the wolf's flank. That's all I can ask, I suppose. We've lost enough in this war already. A hush lingered. Theon thought of Bran, crippled in Winterfell, Rickon with his wildness, Sansa and Arya parted from their family, Ned Stark gone. The cost weighed heavily, especially here in Seaguard, where a precarious hope for peace flickered. Tomorrow, then, Theon said. Let's see if all this talk can truly bind our houses. Robb nodded. Then, with a subdued farewell, he turned and left, gray wind at his side. Theon watched him vanish into the shadows of the keep, feeling both relief and sorrow. Perhaps in another life, they would have greeted each other with easy camaraderie, but now a gulf of blood and loyalty stretched between them. Morning arrived with dreary skies. The sept within Seaguard's walls was small but had been draped with banners for the occasion. The Kraken of House Greyjoy, the Direwolf of House Stark, and the Silver Trout of House Tully. Lords and ladies filled the pews, a tense hush blanketing them as Harren Greyjoy and Celia Tully stood before the altar. A Septon presided, reciting the vows of the Seven. Balon stood grimly near his nephew, Robb at Celia's side, both men watchers and enforcers of the Union. Edmure Tully fidgeted, glancing at the Ironborn in attendance. Theon stood among the crowd, next to Yara. She wore a bored expression, arms crossed, as though resentful of the ceremony. The Ironborn rarely bothered with the faith of the Seven, preferring the drowned god's rites. Still, for the sake of alliance, they bore it. The Septon's voice droned on, weaving promises of unity and mutual defense. Theon felt a flicker of genuine hope. If Harren and Celia's marriage took root, it might solidify a lasting peace. When the Septon finished, Harren and Celia exchanged a chaste kiss. Applause rippled, hesitant at first, then growing as both sides realized the ceremony was complete. Balon Greyjoy lifted his chin, mask-like. Robb offered the faintest of smiles, placing a hand gently on Celia's shoulder. Harren looked both proud and terrified. Theon found himself clapping along, swallowing an odd lump in his throat. Even if the reasons for this match were largely political, it was a bridge between two worlds that seldom found common ground. Afterward came another feast in the main hall. Food was more plentiful this time. Roasted boar, fish stews, hearty bread, and barrels of ale. Though the tension hadn't vanished, a fragile conviviality took hold. Theon drank sparingly, mindful that a drunken tongue might cause chaos. He watched as Harren awkwardly danced with his new bride to the music of a small band, while lords from both sides murmured about the improbable union. Robb rose eventually to toast the couple. May the union of Greyjoy and Tully stand firm as the seas themselves. Let no man break these vows, lest he face the wrath of both houses. Balon offered a reluctant nod, raising his cup in a show of solidarity. Theon noted that many eyes lingered on Balon, gauging the sincerity of that gesture. It seemed the day would end peacefully. As the feast wound down, guests began drifting away to their chambers. Harren and Celia departed under a polite cheer from the onlookers, heading to whatever conjugal awkwardness awaited them. Balon lingered, talking with Yara and a few captains. Robb spoke quietly with Edmure and Catelyn, occasionally glancing at the Ironborn. Theon hovered near the dais, uncertain whether to excuse himself or remain. At length, Robb approached him. "It's done," he said, voice soft enough that others wouldn't overhear. "We'll see if the marriage proves binding. For now, at least, there is no immediate cause for the Iron Islands to stand against us." Theon exhaled. "That was all I wanted. Let your war with the Lannisters continue without fear of another front. Our father, my father, has what he wants." Robb nodded. "Still, if Balon breaks faith, you know what must happen. We'll come for him." His eyes searched Theon's face. "I'd rather not see that day." "So would I," Theon said, meeting Robb's gaze. "I'll do my best to steer him clear of it. But the old man's pride is a raging sea, Robb. I can't promise miracles." A slight flicker crossed Robb's face, something like regret. He held out his hand. After a beat, Theon clasped it. For one tenuous moment, It felt like old friends reuniting. Then Robb pulled away. "Farewell, Theon. I'll be watching your father's next moves." Theon offered a small bow, stepping back. A swirl of emotions flooded him. Relief, sorrow, fear. He turned and left Robb to his kin, threading through the hall until he emerged into the corridor. Yara was there, leaning against a column. She eyed him, arms folded. "So now it's done," she remarked. "Do you truly believe this marriage will keep us all from each other's throats?" Theon shrugged, the flickering torchlight painting shadows on the walls. "For a time, perhaps. That's more than we had before." She nodded in grudging acceptance. "Father plans to sail back tomorrow. You should come with us? Or do you mean to linger here, polishing the wolf boy's boots?" He bristled but kept his tone even. "I've had my fill of being torn in two. Let's go home." Yara cracked a dry smile and led the way to the courtyard. Outside, a soft drizzle dampened the air. Theon tasted rain on his lips, feeling the swirl of brine in his veins. Perhaps, after all this, the North and the Iron Islands might coexist without a fresh tide of slaughter. The war with the Lannisters would rage on, but at least Ned Stark's homeland would be spared the axes of House Greyjoy, so long as Balon's thirst for plunder was sated elsewhere. He drew a deep breath. The sea beckoned, as did the uncertain horizon. Yet, for the first time in weeks, Theon felt a glimmer of uneasy peace. He had done all he could. Whatever storms lay ahead, he would face them knowing that, in this moment, he had kept two worlds from devouring each other. And for a man who belonged to both Iron Islands and Winterfell, that was enough.